Okay friends, it's time to get started on replacing our rear brakes. One of the first things you're going to want to do is safely raise and support the rear of the vehicle so both wheels are up and off the ground. After that, let's safely remove all 5 of our 21mm lug nuts and then the wheel. If you find that you have a locking lug like this one right here, you're going to also want to make sure that you find the corresponding key that leads to it. Let's get this into position. Remove your wheel. Now that we have the wheels off of here, we have a nice clear view of our entire braking system for the right rear. Looking at this, you can see the caliper. For the caliper, you're going to have a piston that goes right in and out right here. What we need to do is push that piston all the way into the caliper just to ensure that it functions properly. When this is pushing in, you're also going to notice that the slider pins right here should also be moving in. When I do this, I'm just going to use a nice pry bar, carefully get in between the caliper and the rotor, and then I'm going to gently pry as slow as possible. This isn't a race, slow and steady wins. There we are. Now at this point, you can see that my piston made its way all the way in, and the slider pins work as they should. This is a double confirmation. The next thing that we're going to do is continue on by removing our 2 caliper slider bolts. Now for these 2 caliper slider pins, you're going to notice that we're going to use a 14mm wrench to start removing these, but once you have it fully loose, it's going to want to slide out and it's going to hit up against this bar right here. So essentially all we really want to do is just loosen them up to the point that they are plenty loose for us, and then we're going to continue on to the 2 caliper bracket bolts that are located right behind it. That one's nice and loose, we'll leave it in there. Now for most brake jobs, you would typically just take the sliders and slide them right out. Like I told you, it's going to hit right up against this bar. So we'll just leave it in here. Now we can continue on to these 2 bolts using our 17mm. Now we'll continue on to our 2 caliper bracket bolts using our 19mm. Now we'll continue on to our 2 caliper bracket bolts using our 19mm. Each of these bolts is going to have a washer attached to it. Make sure you don't lose that. Fully remove both of those bolts, set them aside. Now we can carefully grab onto the caliper and the bracket, and we're going to start separating the 2. Okay, now look at these 2 caliper slider pins. Looking at one of them, you're going to see a vibration dampener down near the very end of it. It's super important to make sure it goes into the exact same port that you originally removed it from. For us in particular, looking at this, it was in the top hole. Keep that in mind for during the installation. Let's go ahead and carefully separate this area here. We're going to put this caliper up so it's putting no pressure on the flex hose. Okay, so now over at the bench, as you can tell, I took each of those slider pins and I put them in the original port as when I removed them. So if I was to take this one out right here, which would be the upper port, you can tell that I still have that rubber dampener on here. Let's just go ahead and set it down on the corresponding side. Now after that, let's continue on to removing our brake pads. Now for the pads, typically you can just go ahead and remove them from the bracket. Let's take a quick look at that inner brake pad. What you're going to notice is that it does have a wear indicator on it. In comparison to the outer aspect, it does not have the wear indicator. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at your brake pads. Also in the brake pads, you're going to notice that you have two pads that have the wear indicator, but one's going to be located on the other side of the pad. So just make sure when you're checking your pads, you have the corresponding side. Now the next thing that we're going to do is continue on to removing the caliper tins. For these, typically I just carefully grab onto it and carefully pull it away. If it doesn't want to come off, just go ahead and pry it off with whatever tool you might happen to have. Now at this point, there really isn't anything that's special about these tins, in exception of the fact that with your kit, you probably noticed the tins came with two different sets. Now looking at these four tins that are located right here, you can tell exactly what I mean. The tins that are located right next to my original have a nice wide area, just like this one right here. If I was to come over to these tins, you're going to notice that the area in between the two tabs is much thinner. So basically just confirm which tins you need to use, and then set aside the other tins for recycling. Remove your slider boots, carefully grab onto it, give it a little squeeze. After you have it off of there, you're going to want to inspect it. Give it a little squeeze like this. Make sure it's nice and soft and pliable. It doesn't just squeeze in and then stay like that. As you can tell, this is nice and soft. I'm also just going to roll it around and carefully look at it. What I'm looking for is any dry rots or cracks. Typically, that's going to be in one of these grooves. As you can tell, this one still looks good. So what we're going to do at this point is continue on with a rag. And I'm going to carefully try to put it through this hole that's in it and bring it out through the other end. You might need to just twist the rag a little bit. Now once it's through there, we're just going to carefully roll this around, essentially just cleaning out any dirt or debris or gunk that's located inside this boot. Now once you have it cleaned out, just take a quick peek inside and just confirm that it is actually clean. There can't be any dirt inside this area. Once you're sure it looks good, go ahead and set it aside and do the exact same thing to the other side. Now let's continue on to each of the caliper slider pins. The areas that you want to clean is of course the entire shaft of this area all the way up to the bushing. And the areas that you want to pay special attention to is of course the entire shaft. You want to make sure it doesn't have any pitting or any damage to that. Anything that's going to restrict this from moving in and out of that slider port is going to need to be cleaned up. But also, pretty much right where my thumbnail is, if you could imagine it since I have gloves on, there's actually a little ridge here. That ridge is exactly where this boot needs to ride, so you need to make sure that it's clean and free of any debris in there as well. That's going to help prevent moisture or debris from making its way in here and clogging this up. Now that we have all that cleaned up, let's start cleaning the bracket itself. Now the areas that you're going to want to clean are all four areas that you went ahead and removed those tins from. So we want to make sure you get along this ridge, along inside here as well, and generally I like to get up along this ridge as well. So we'll just essentially clean out this entire area, this one right here, and then the exact same thing on the other side of the bracket. Now, as you can tell, both of these edges look amazing. We can continue on to do the exact same thing on the other side of the bracket. Now once you have all four corners cleaned up, the next areas that I like to clean are the slider ports themselves. So right in here is the hole that the slider goes into, and it's essentially going to go inside this entire area right there. Now for this, of course, you're going to want to make sure you have hand and eye protection. We're going to use some parts cleaner, spray right inside this port, and then a bore brush to clean out any debris that might be located inside. Once you have the inside of the ports clean, just take a quick peek inside. You want to make sure that you don't see any corrosion or any dimples or anything inside that might restrict that caliper slider from functioning properly. Assuming that looks good, let's get along these ridges right here as well. You just want to make sure that that's clean and free of debris. Once again, this is going to help make sure that nothing falls inside there and potentially blocks up that slider from functioning properly. Now the next thing we're going to do is carefully take some high temperature caliper grease. The areas we're going to use this are along all four corners of the caliper bracket that we just went ahead and sanded down. By applying this grease, it's going to help with vibration dampening, noise reduction, and of course it's going to help make sure moisture doesn't get into this area and potentially cause rust. Now once you have that lubricated, go ahead and grab onto the corresponding tin. We're going to slide it right into position. Now for these tins, you're going to want to make sure that you completely press them down and into the brackets. If you were to look along the inner aspect of this, you can tell exactly where the locking mechanism is for each side. There's one right here, and there's going to be one located right there. So you essentially just need to make sure they're completely pressed in, and then of course do the exact same thing on the other side. Press that in there as hard as I can. And now at this point, we can continue on with our caliper grease. We're going to essentially just put a little bit right inside each of these ports. And then once you get a tiny bit inside the ports, you're also going to get along each of those lips right there, just along the outer aspect. That's going to help keep moisture out. Now we can take each of our caliper slider boots and we're going to put them right onto the caliper bracket. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and put my finger right over this end here, which essentially is going to hold pressure in here while I try to force this over. Once you have it over, just give it a little twist to make sure it's completely secured. After that, do the exact same thing to the other one. Okay, so now we can move back over to the vehicle. There's a couple things we want to do with this caliper. Of course, we're going to want to make sure that we clean it down from any dirt or debris that might be on this, or even some brake dust. Let's use my wire brush, give it a little scrub. Now the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and push in our caliper piston just to ensure that it's completely situated in its far back position. Now to push this in, I'm just going to go ahead and use a caliper compression tool here. Just go ahead and squeeze that until it bottoms out. Now we're going to continue on with a little bit more of that high temperature caliper grease. The areas that you want to apply some lubricant to is the metal aspect of the caliper piston here. And then the backside of each of these two ears. This is going to help with vibration dampening and noise reduction. Okay, so now we can start getting the rotor off of here. To remove that, the first thing that I always do is just go ahead and remove this rubber protective boot right here. Now the reason why this is on here is because if you were to turn this into the proper position, you're going to be able to find the adjuster for the emergency brake shoes that are located behind this area. Your new rotor and brake kit does not come with this, so you want to make sure you transfer it over to the new brakes when you have them installed. Now I'm just going to go ahead and take one of my lug nuts. I'll start it on here a few good threads. After that, I'm going to continue with my hammer, and I'm going to give this a couple loving bonks just to break it free from the hub that's located behind it. When I do this, I want to be very careful not to damage the threads on these studs. If you do that, you're either going to have to chase it or, of course, replace it. Remove your rotor, set it aside. With the rotor off, you can see exactly what I was talking about the e-brake adjuster. That's this area here. What you would want to do is once you have this all back together, we're going to make an adjustment with this unit. So of course, I'm going to go ahead and clean down the hub mating surface where that rotor is going to sit. But I also want to make sure I clean down the entire area along here where you have the adjuster, and of course, inspect and clean my emergency brake shoes as well. Now, as you can tell, I cleaned down the majority of the surface where the rotor is going to sit up against, but there are areas that I couldn't clean with that tool, essentially the area in between each stud and the hub. So to do that, of course, you could use a wire brush or whatever tool you might happen to have. For me personally, I have this little disc right here. It's going to go right over the studs and clean up the areas that I need it to. Okay, so at this point, as you can tell, it looks pretty great all the way around. I'm sure that the mating surface is free and clear of any debris. I would just want to spray it down with some parts cleaner to make sure it's clean. While I'm cleaning this, we might as well clean up the entire backside as well. Essentially, all of the e-brake shoes, you have that adjuster right up here. You want to make sure it's clean and free of any of that debris you can see up along the top. But then you also have an e-brake actuator that's located right down in this area right here. So essentially, when you pull on that e-brake lever, this is going to pivot along this point here and go ahead and separate these shoes a little bit. So you just, of course, want to make sure it's nice and clean and free of any debris as well. Good. So now that I have all this cleaned up, the next thing that I always try to do is just use a little bit of penetrant spray. I'm going to essentially go along the area where I can see there's threads for the adjuster. Just try to divert it directly into this area, just a tiny bit. Now down along this area, there's also going to be another little small gap. For that one right there, I just put a tiny bit of penetrant as well. And now if you were to follow it down underneath here, you're going to find the area with the actuator for the e-brake. It's going to, of course, have to pivot, so you want to make sure that you spray a tiny bit of penetrant in there. Now once we have all that sprayed down, let's continue on by applying a thin amount of copper never sees to the mating surface of the hub where the rotor is going to sit. Now it's going to be time to clean down the braking surfaces on our rear rotor. For this, there's going to be 3 braking surfaces you need to pay attention to. We've got the outer aspect. Use a little bit of parts cleaner on that. We'll wipe it down. Go ahead and turn that around. Now you have your 2 other braking surfaces. You have the main braking surface along here, and then you have the area inside this area for the e-brake shoes. Clean it up. Once that's clean, let's go ahead and get our rotor on here. Take one of your lug nuts here. We're just going to start this out, bottom it out against the rotor so the rotor can't move around on us. Now the next thing we're going to have to do is start adjusting our e-brake shoes. So you remember where that adjuster is, right inside this area here. This is where we're going to make the adjustment. You can just go ahead and turn this till it lines up with that cog. Then take your screwdriver, put it in there, and carefully make your adjustments. Now to make this adjustment, we're going to want to do this process with the caliper still off of this. Essentially, you just want to take this and try to give it a little spin. What we're feeling for is just a tiny bit of drag on the inside of this rotor from those emergency brake shoes. If you try to turn this and it doesn't want to turn, you're going to have to de-adjust this area right here. If you can take it and spin it and you don't hear any scraping noise inside there, typically you're going to have to adjust this up a little bit. Now to adjust these shoes out a little bit, what you would want to do is just take your nice flat screwdriver, carefully put it through this hole and put it up against that cog. Once you have it against it, you can carefully bring your screwdriver up. That's going to push these out a little bit, and then you're just going to recheck it. If you get to the point that it's too tight and you can't turn it, you need to de-adjust it. Keep in mind, your e-brake shoes are going to heat up due to friction, so if you over-adjust these, those are going to heat up and they're going to expand even further, and you might potentially lock up your brakes. So if anything, a little bit de-adjusted is better than over-adjusted. We've got our rubber boot here. Go ahead and reinsert that once you've made your adjustment. Now the next thing we're going to do is start preparing our caliper sliders here. What I want to do is just take this high temperature caliper grease, and I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I coat this entire shaft of the slider pin. When I do this, I'm also going to make my way all the way up into the groove where that boot's supposed to sit, but also attempting not to get any on the threaded area, which of course is where you can see that I used a little bit of red thread locker on each. Let's take this bracket, we're going to slide it right down and over the caliper. And now we're going to go ahead and start putting in our caliper slider pins. I'm going to take the one that has the rubber bushing. Of course, I coated the entire shaft and I put a little bit of red thread locker on the threads. Now I'm just going to take this, we'll slide it right on in through that boot. We can start it into the caliper. Do the same for the other slider pin here. Let's snug these up. Now once we have that all together, let's just make a quick inspection of the caliper slider boots. Just go ahead and take that caliper, slide it in and out, and make sure it's sitting on the grooves for both sides. Now it's going to be time to insert our brake pads. You remember when I was talking to you about brake pads, how one of them is going to have the wear indicator on it. You want to make sure that you have the pad with the wear indicator on the rearward or inboard aspect, the side with the caliper piston. You also, of course, want to make sure it's facing in the same direction as when you originally removed it. So for me personally, I'm just going to go ahead and take this. We'll slide it down and inside this caliper bracket. We're going to line up the ear inside there, and then the ear inside the other side, and slide it right into position. If you find that you have to force it in there, use a pry bar or a hammer for any reason, more than likely you didn't clean up the caliper bracket properly. Do this outer pad same way, one ear, then the other. Now we can go ahead and slide this right over our rotor. Once it's in position, take both of your caliper bracket bolts with some red thread locker, start them in there, and we'll bottom them out. Okay, so we have this all bottomed out. Now at this point, we're going to start torquing this. Let's torque the caliper bracket to the knuckle bolts first. For these, we're going to torque them to 62 foot-pounds with our 19 millimeter. This upper bolt right here, I can access fairly easily with my torque wrench. Now for the lower bolts, obviously to be able to torque this, there isn't very much room. So I'm just going to go ahead and take my 19 millimeter wrench. We're going to make sure it's nice and tight. If you felt as though you really wanted to torque this down, you can go ahead and try to unbolt this arm right here from both sides, remove it, and then of course you can torque it. But at that point, more than likely it's a good idea to get yourself in alignment. Torqued. Now we're going to torque each of our caliper slider bolts to 32 foot-pounds. See if I can get this in there. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so now we can go ahead and get this lug nut off of here. Double check everything. Make sure you torqued everything along the way. The pads are sitting as they should be. And of course, the flex hose down along the back here isn't twisted in any way. After that, let's throw our wheel up on here. We'll start on all of our lug nuts, snug them up, get the wheel back on the ground before we torque it to manufacturer's specification. Now with the wheel safely back on the ground so it can't turn on us, let's go ahead and torque each of these lug nuts to 83 foot-pounds in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Okay friends, we got one side of the rear brakes done. What's left to do now? Now you're going to do the exact same thing on the other side of the vehicle. After that, go ahead and hop inside that passenger compartment. Pump up the brake pedal till it's nice and firm, then pop underneath the hood, double check that master cylinder. That's the area with the brake fluid. You want to make sure it's topped off to that maximum line. If you need to add a little bit, just put in a little splash of .3 up to the maximum, close it up, close the hood, take it for a road test. Thanks for watching.